I wanted to welcome you all back to the Be Better Club. As many of you know, Dr. Hubler and I put these together out of the Center for Ethics as a chance to have informal discussions, sort of public-facing discussions about really contemporary ethical issues. And this semester's series are all about ethical implications of AI. So we've done a series of these this semester, coming up on our last couple. And today's topic is AI and data privacy, which is a really big topic. And you probably saw that I share, as I do every time, sort of framing podcast that's just a little bit randomly chosen from the huge selection of podcasts available to us, but it gives us a point of contact for starting those discussions. In this case, I think we're all really asking the same questions, which are, how much do we worry about privacy? And in a historical context, how has that changed over time? And what now is AI doing to our conceptions of privacy? Again, I've got things to say as always, but I would just welcome anybody starting anywhere with that discussion. And maybe we can just do really brief introductions. So I'm Jonathan Beaver. I'm an associate professor of ethics and digital culture here at UCF, and with Dr. Kubler, the director of the Center for Ethics. Steve, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. What he said, and professor of chemistry and optics, and really glad to be here. Always so good to see returning faces and new faces. Makes for great discussion. Maybe Dan Lepresto next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dan Lepresto, Data Protection Officer and Privacy Compliance Director for UCF. Good to meet you all.
Yeah. Sarah, I see you next on my screen. You want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Norris. I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at the UCF Libraries, and I'm particularly interested in copyright and intellectual property as it relates to AI and other data privacy matters. And I guess I can turn it over to, I see Alex on the screen.
Hi, everyone. Great to meet you all. My name is Alex Nicolaitis. I'm a postdoctoral scholar for the UCF Center for Ethics. I see other people have their cameras closed. So, Michael, I see you're unmuted if you would like to introduce.
Sure. I'm Michael Furlong. I'm an associate librarian at UCF and based in Daytona, UCF Connect, and also a colleague of Sarah's.
Great to have you, Michael. Thanks. And
Thanks.
Marcia, I know we've seen you before. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I just had some ethics positions when I worked. I'm no longer working. I'm retired. I'm a member of the Life at UCF program. I'm just fascinated by this topic. So I listen in and participate whenever it makes sense for that. Thank you.
Yeah, really good to have you, Marcia. And student, we haven't met yet, but if you want to introduce yourself, you're welcome to.
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm Parker. I'm a student at UCF. I'm a second year. And I just came across this meeting and I thought the topic was really interesting. So I wanted to kind of see what you guys were about.
Right on, Parker. Yeah, really good to have you. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah. Again, I think you've all heard, you heard me say just a minute ago, these are really intended to be informal discussions. So we all bring different expertise to the table around these big picture issues. And that for me is what's so compelling about them, because our perspectives really shape the discussion. So we can start anywhere, but one of the things that really caught me in the podcast was that the podcast host, who's a philosopher in North Dakota, said that what we meant by privacy in 1992 is very different than what we mean by privacy now. And he said that in the context of financial privacy, because and this kind of blew my mind. It's maybe showing my age, but in 1992, the idea of credit scores were only 3 years old. And I think that's an incredibly interesting nugget of historical data. So the space between 1992 and 2023 is very big in terms of the digital technologies and their implications. So the big picture framing question for me, I think, is about the exchange of privacy or freedom for access and security. That tension's not new, of course, but I wondered what you all thought about that exchange or that tension.
Well, I'll speak up. One thing is to maybe look back historically and see, are there enough instances where it turned out we didn't have enough security and we're erring too much on the side of caution, or are there actually a preponderance of incidents where we were expecting, a great apocalypse, and it turned out it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be, and so we've sacrificed maybe security, or sacrificed personal security for safety or whatever too much of the time. I mean, there is a balance, and those things are in tension, but it helps to look over your shoulder and see what path you trod, and maybe that can help inform the future. It looks like, if you think back to 9/11, we actually had the intel we needed. We didn't listen to it properly, and that's documented fact. So did we need more surveillance in order to avoid it? No. And now I think we'll all look back at the Israeli situation, and see what happened there. I wonder what's going to happen with that society. So that's something I think we should do that would inform us. But I think the situation to me is a little bit different way with AI, because there's a much greater power differential. The general person can decide not to tick a box or give their information, and can opt out and therefore retain personal information. But in the case of AI, it's a little bit more subtle, because it's ubiquitous. You may not even know you're using it in terms of search engines and things like that, and so it's available to the common person, but the common person doesn't have the agency to really know what's happening with their data, and it really is a very small number of stakeholders who control these sophisticated tools and the data that we surrender to them unknowingly when you play with a search tool that has AI embedded in it. So that makes me a little bit concerned. I think about the power differential that is there, and how much easier it might be to exploit someone who doesn't understand what's going on with that. And that's someone, it could very well be me, even though I'm sitting here talking about it as though I know what it is.
Yeah, those rate of change concerns are so interesting to me, right? Part of it is about AI is just the speed at which that technology is, let's say, advancing, for lack of a better term. I was talking to my undergrads about this just yesterday, and was reminded that ChatGPT-3 has an 8,000 word short-term memory capacity, and a closed data set on which it has been fed. ChatGPT-4 has a 64,000 word short-term memory capacity and an expanding data set in multilingual capacities, and I just read that the CTO of OpenAI, the chief technology officer, has suggested, but as soon as the end of 2023, which is a 2 years sooner than was previously announced, ChatGPT-5 might be publicly released. And that is proposed to be an artificial general intelligence. So a significant advancement over where we are, even with ChatGPT-4. That rate of change in just a 2.5 year period or less exacerbates, I think, the problem that you're talking about, Dr. Kubler. Like, how do you keep up with concerns about privacy given the rate of change of these technologies?
I think that, and the rate of adoption as well. I mean, the number of ChatGPT and Bard and several, there's hundreds now, but the folks that are jumping on it are jumping in like neck deep and going as far as they can with it. And I don't know that they, to your earlier point, Dr. Beaver, understand about the nuances needed for personal data protection and privacy. And so what we may find is folks don't end up sanitizing the documents that they put in there. They just put it in there because it's there and it's easy and it's quick. And then eventually we'll get awareness to catch up, and they'll say, okay, great, but that's a lot of work to sanitize my calendar or whatever it is I want to feed in there. So I don't know that I'm going to do that. I'm not worried about people's privacy. It's probably fine. And then in goes more personal data. But if you read the terms and conditions, both Bard and ChatGPT say don't put personal information in here. I know Bard says it boldly. ChatGPT is a little different, but at the end of the day, who's reading that? Who's listening to it and abiding by it versus taking what they want from it, which is what it can do, which is the priority to most people.
Right. Yeah. And Dan, the tool, as I understand it, right, the proprietary versions of ChatGPT are being fed relatively closed data sets. So they're working on very specific tasks and tools right now. But even on the chatbot side, our faculty are, especially in arts and humanities, are suggesting that we use the OpenAI API on the back end, because there's an option to opt out of your data being fed back into the tool. the thing that worries me is and also excites me weirdly, morbidly, is that ChatGPT 5 that's being proposed will be multimodal, multimedia. So it will take audio input rather than typed input. It will be able to track and recognize facial emotion. So to be able to understand sarcasm and irony and feed that back to you, or not necessarily, but respond to emotional cues. So the sorts of inputs over which we have even less control than what we might type in or feed in is another problem of this sort of scope.
Sounds a bit like the metaverse when it comes to looking at facial expressions, right? Because they're going to be looking for ads and, you know, where do your eyes go when you see this ad for Budweiser or whatnot, and what attracts your attention and what are you clicking on and what is your face saying? And so if they're going to do that in this space, they're taking some elements from the metaverse that are useful in their eyes and building them in, which brings a whole new set of nuances to consider. But it'll be very, very interesting for sure.
Yeah, and you know, I am not qualified at all, Dan, especially directed to you to talk about the legal context of privacy, but I think that's so interesting, right? That the legal landscape around privacy is, we're still indebted to the old British UK models of physical metaphors for privacy, right? The reasonable expectation clauses and all of these things are based on literal physical metaphors that you could close your shutters and then you've got a reasonable expectation, but if you open them, you don't. And that metaphor has broken down. It just doesn't seem to apply. And our regulatory landscape hasn't quite caught up yet.
Oh, we're dragging feet. I mean, if states like California and other states have to create their own and set the bar so high that a federal is even harder now to put out, we're looking at least another year or two before we see a federal privacy law, and we need it. Other countries are saying, you guys are so far behind. We don't want to share data with you. And if we do, you have to go through 6 hoops to do it. We need to absolutely approach this landscape, not just for privacy, but also in the AI space too. We need to have some guardrails. We can't just let it become this growing plant that, you know, covers the house and starts to cover the world. We have to have ways to use it properly and manage it a bit.
Yeah. To extend the metaphor, the other thing the podcast brought up is the extent to which we're fertilizing those plants, right? The idea that our information is worth a tremendous amount of money and private corporations are leading the charge in developing these technologies and rolling them out. I know I've said, Alex and Steve, to you before, but I am regularly think about the I can't think of the word now, sorry, the commentary, federal commentary that the CEO of OpenAI gave in front of the congressional panel, where he said, basically, I think content creators should own their content and you need to regulate me. So he said this to representatives and congresspeople, and they were like, we hear you and don't know how to do that, and good luck, right? And that was months ago. So, yeah. Sarah, you say you wonder if the EU will drive some different privacy laws, especially with the GDPR introduced a few years ago. Yeah, there's already, I mean, even before AI, there were these differences sort of between the continent and across the ponds in the legal context. Yeah.
When I hear Supreme Court rulings on things involving big tech and Apple and things like that, I'm not especially heartened that the people that are ruling on it fully understand these technologies also. And I think also, as far as the ethics go, there's been a lot of talk about how you would create an ethical AI. And obviously the way that doesn't work is to go through and sort of give, open content to all the different electronic conversations and things that go on, because then you pull in racism and other problems on these engines too. So, I mean, I have some ideas how you could possibly avoid that, but acting like a human would be also acting like all the different negative versions of behaviors that we've seen online often.
Yep. I was thinking, as you were talking, Michael, about Mary Gray's work, and I think, Dan, I brought this up to you before, but Mary is a Microsoft MacArthur Fellow and a Microsoft employee, works on AI ethics. I'll put her website in the chat, but Mary's big thing, I keep running into her in sort of AI ethics events. And Mary's big talking point is that on the back end of AI right now, ChatGPT and other AI systems is human labor. So as you're saying, right, there's a lot of curation about what goes in, what's fed into AI systems, and a lot of curation about limiting what comes out of AI systems.
Yeah, the curation has to be, I mean, I think a very problematic or difficult task, I think.
I think it was the CEO of, was it Signal, that gave a recent talk on how the labor is used in other countries, and how it's just ridiculous what they're doing to individuals, making them work 12-hour days to take content and bring it into AI. And I guess I wish there could have been a visual of that, because it would have stuck with me better. But it was kind of mortifying to hear her say this. And she had a lot of strong opinions. If you ever get a chance to look up what she spoke on, it was fairly recent. I want to say within the past month. And I'll try to find her name before, and I'll put it in the chat. But it was definitely worth hearing. I heard it once. I want to go back and listen to it again, because there's just so much that she was unpacking.
Yeah. It's the human labor stories, especially 12-hour days, undervalued and underprivileged employees doing this kind of work. That kind of comes around to the idea that what seems like a simple and straightforward idea, that technology corporations don't have our interests, don't put our interests first, right? That's not their point. That's not their job.
Oh yeah, not at all.
And so that exacerbates this problem then of, like, to what extent are they even interested in protecting our privacy? And I guess when I'm thinking about this, I feel like I'm circling around a million things, but there's a sense in which, to what extent do corporations, should corporations, let's make it a normative claim, to what extent should corporations protect our privacy? Then there's a second question about, to what extent do we care about our privacy? And there's a third question, what do we mean by privacy? And all of those things intersect in these really fascinating spaces for me. Oh, thanks, Dan. So this is Meredith.
Yeah, it's Meredith Whitaker is her name. I don't know if it's going to link to the video, but it probably does. I haven't combed it, but they had this interview, and she just went all out on her views on it, and it was rather eye-opening. Just, I mean, with the labor, and I think she talked about African markets, as Sarah just posted that as well. But she just went into a lot of depth that it was so overwhelming that I want to go back and hear it again, because I was like, oh my God, for real? So I definitely recommend that talk.
Jonathan, to your question, I think, and that was kind of what caught my attention in the podcast, because of all the great examples and my relatively limited knowledge with regard to, what data exists on the internet. And thinking about the question, what is privacy? What do we mean about privacy? And do we care about privacy? As separate from, what should corporations do? Makes me wonder, whether we are even able to make an informed or a decision really about whether we care about privacy, when we don't really understand what our data, what data of ours is out there, how it is used, and what that means for us, especially when there's so much data that down the road it could be used in ways that are, not foreseeable, especially for lay people. And so, herein comes the responsibility, I guess. Corporate responsibility can be kind of joined perhaps with the responsibility of the creators as experts, who, because they know so much, have perhaps a greater social responsibility to think about these things more than we do. And the burden should fall more so on them than it does on us. Because, even if people are inclined to read all these long disclaimers that we were talking about, and it becomes easier to opt out, things like that, it still seems to me that there's a lot of space for people making decisions that they do not really understand. And of course, someone can say we don't want to be paternalistic or anything like that, but I do think we should be more cautious and protect people more so than we do now.
Yeah, Oh, excuse me. Yeah, Alex, I'm on board. That's well said. And I think I've also got this intuition that top-down regulatory approaches are going to be necessary. Because it's not only, I think it's not only the case that we don't understand how our data is used, but we are actively manipulated into the idea that giving up our data is a good idea, right? The idea, the podcast brought up the idea of dopamine hits, right? That especially social media systems are intentionally designed to give you the happy feels when you get the likes and the thumbs up and I mean, that's by design. And so you're incentivized, then manipulated might be too strong a word, perhaps, but you are incentivized to keep giving, right? So not only do I not know what my data is doing when it's gone, but I'm incentivized to give it up in the first place. And that double whammy makes me very nervous.
Has anyone watched The Social Dilemma?
Yeah, Dan, yeah.
That should almost be a requirement. It does, to Alex's point, it actually will share some of what's done with our data and how it plays on emotions and how it hits and how depressed the generations can get. I mean, there are people who, you know, rise to fame very quickly and get used to that, much like Britney Spears did. And then all of a sudden, if that starts to dip, with that comes depression and upset and financial ramifications. And they go from this mega high of I'm on top of the world to, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And when they're very young, and even as folks are older, they can't necessarily handle that. And so while social media purports all that, the ramifications, people just need to understand what they're getting into. I'm not saying that we should necessarily make them stop or try to force them to not go on social media in certain ways and functions, but they need to understand what they're getting into, because it's almost like a drug. And, you know, if you read the label of what you're taking before you go to bed, you might understand that, you know, melatonin might mess up your dreams a little bit, but you might sleep better. And, you know, as someone who's taken it, I know that I've had some weird dreams, but I sleep better. And that's, at least I understand the side effects. Yeah. If you don't understand the side effects of social media and AI and your sharing of your data, you're going to end up on potentially the other side of things, where now your information is being used. You're not making money from it, but others are. And now your personal privacy. I mean, shoot, I was on LinkedIn just on my screen and on a phone call with a colleague, and she was also on LinkedIn. I had turned my ads off and she had not. And we named 2 institutions, Dell and Webster University, both of which came up in our feed within 30 seconds to a minute of mentioning them on LinkedIn, which meant my phone conversation was tied to the internet and brought back ads correlating to what we thought was a private conversation on our work phone. It wasn't even our cell phones. It was actually our work phone. So at that point, I felt privacy's out the door, at least at that point in time. But yeah, there's a lot of scary things that happen with our data we are just none the wiser about, to Alex's point.
I think dopamine is a good analogy. I think also like a frog slowly being boiled in a pot of water is another good analogy. Yeah. I mean, not unfortunately, it's a good analogy. It's not, you know, not beneficial to us, but since we've had this gradual things from, say, Microsoft terms of agreements, search engines, and things like that that many people don't fully understand, and then to go to AI, which is sort of you know, exacerbating all this. I think that since there's no opt out, and like as in like my current job, I have to do, even if I had no online life outside of work, I would have to do certain things like you're talking about, work discussions and things like that, where I would still be sharing data and doing that in order to go through and earn a living. So that's how I view it.
Yeah. Those trade-offs are real. I was thinking about this in the context of a former student of mine who did a dissertation in cybersecurity as a cybersecurity professional on sort of the ethics side. And that project is great, and I would love to connect this person back to the university, but they have kind of gone dark in terms of digital presence, I think partly because of their work. And so the trade-off is real, right? Like, really good researcher, hard to track down and connect. Yeah, we're constantly in that space.
To Michael's point, I just wanted to reference an article, some journal of business ethics, I don't remember now exactly, but it was talking about addiction to social media as being such a unique, well, there were a couple of things that they were talking about, one of which being exploiting the person themselves to make the product more addictive to them by collecting personalized information. But one thing relevant to this conversation was how it's really ubiquitous. Like Michael, you were saying, you can't really avoid using it, right? Even if
Right.
for many things, if you just don't give permission, okay, you don't download the app, you can't communicate with your coworkers, right? So it's not like you can avoid it in any way. You're sort of coerced to be part of this general ecosystem. And this, I think, makes it even more of greater importance, really, to actually do something to regulate it strongly, because it's one thing if it was completely voluntary and, you know, people can engage with it or they can stay out of it, which maybe used to be the case, you know, when social media and things like that were in their infancy. But now you can't really avoid it. You have an internet presence, you need to have an internet presence, unless you want to be doing certain types of jobs that don't require it, which are likely less likely to be higher salaried professional jobs. You're kind of forced to be a part of this, and so you're forced to these privacy, I guess, or not having privacy policies of the social media. I liked also the reference to the kind of Orwellian language that is used, the privacy agreement, which is not really about maintaining your privacy, but violating it.
Double speak, yeah.
Yeah.
The privacy wants and needs of the individual are basically a barrier to entry when it comes to social media. It's completely a trade-off. And when they're giving you something that's free, like an account on Facebook, an account on Twitter, the reason it's free is because you're the product. Your data is the product. That is how you're paying. And so that's how their model functions. So yeah, it's free, but you will give up your rights to privacy. You will give up your rights to secrecy, your rights to any, or your feelings about it even. You can control some things. You know, they've made a paltry effort to add in things that you can, but all of a sudden I get an update on an app and my privacy choices have changed on some of them. And I'm like, well, I remember ticking that box. It's not ticked anymore. And the only reason I noticed it was because I'm a privacy nerd and I happen to go in and look. Think of the people that haven't looked since they ticked that box and it disappeared on an update. And now their data is being free flown and shared with whomever. They're none the wiser.
But I think it's also everyday things too that we don't necessarily think about. Our cars, we just got a new house and there's smart technology in everything, and everything's on an app. And do you connect with that? Do you not? I mean, from seeing that I use the oven or wash something in the washing machine or went someplace in my car in a mapping system, I think that stuff is so pervasive that it is very hard to avoid potential data scraping of everything we do in everyday life, which is so crazy.
It's got to be a balance. I mean, the company Innova knows what I cook on certain nights because I use their oven and I have to go onto their app and I type in what I'm cooking and it shares with me a list of recipes and ways to cook what I want. But then they're logging the fact that I'm cooking venison, roast. And so like, oh, okay, well, but it doesn't bother me at all that they know what I'm eating. It would bother me though if they started getting more information, right? Like the oven would all of a sudden start to track, well, Dan's in the kitchen from 9:30 to 10, probably eating breakfast. He's also in the kitchen from 11:30 to 12:30, probably having lunch. And it's like, well, now you're invading now you know where I am in my home. That's a bit much, but I don't believe the oven does that. But there are things that do. I mean, some of us have Nest or Ecobee or other thermostats, cameras and things that we will trade it off if it gives us enough value, but we have to recognize the value and make an informed decision versus just giving everything out and saying, well, here, you can have all of me. I just want this. And I don't even know what I'm going to do with it yet. Whatever you're offering me, you being social media, AI, et cetera. So it's very, very tenuous for me. I get very worked up about it sometimes when I give it a lot of thought because I'm like, well, I can share this, but I won't share that. And I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have Pinterest. I don't have, I have LinkedIn and I have Facebook. Facebook for family, LinkedIn for business. And that's where I cut it off. There's nothing else in my realm for social media. But I think to Alex's point, you have to have something if you're in certain circles, right? If it wasn't for Facebook, I wouldn't have connected with, a chum from high school, not because I had no other way. And if it wasn't for LinkedIn, I might not have found, my job at UCF, frankly, or other other prospects. So it's definitely trade-off.
Can I ask you, Dan, then, so in terms of you using Facebook and LinkedIn, what are your strategies? Is it just simply your privacy settings, or what do you do in terms of you moderating those two activities?
Well, for one, Facebook doesn't get my real birth date.
Okay.
They know
Yeah.
that I'm male. They now know that I'm married, but that's because my wife wants the world to know that I'm married. But you know, like I will put in fake data. For example, if they ask for my mother's maiden name, that's not my answer. I have a pseudonym for that. So I will curb what I share with LinkedIn and with Facebook, but not to the point of, you know, to where I'm publicly being false. Facebook itself doesn't need to know my exact birth date. If they want to know that I'm the age I am, that's fine, but they don't need to know the exact date. So I'll change it a bit, keep the year. Nobody is harmed by that. But on LinkedIn, I'm very forthcoming because I wanted, you know, at the time at least, I wanted employers and others to see me as me, not me as not me as some avatar that I want to be, some, you know, mega smart. No, this is Dan, and this is what I know, and this is what I don't know, and here's my LinkedIn profile. But even with LinkedIn, I absolutely, Michael, go in and change settings, turn off advertising, you know, turn off what I can, recognizing, of course, there's probably plenty of tomfoolery going on with my data, irrespective
Sure.
of my choices. But at least I'm making the effort, I feel, to curb it where I can, and then recognizing that, yes, they're still going to use my information. If I go view someone else's profile, they log that and they let that person know your profile was viewed by Dan if they're paying the premium rate. So I do give that up, and I'm okay with the way they're using it so far. But LinkedIn was also breached, and that means a lot of information about me that I never intended for anyone to see was leaked. That was years and years ago, but that's unfortunately the way the world is now. When we entrust, there's not a lot of accountability when something happens. They may get fined, but how does it benefit you and I, whose data is now in the hands of other countries and other individuals that don't deserve it?
I think over the last 10 years, between Equifax and different health providers I've had, I think my data has been breached possibly 4 or 5 times over the last 10 years. And I don't know how uncommon that is, but it's probably increasingly common for everybody to have their data breached like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like you've been pwned or whatever, you know, can let people know, or I've been pwned. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's hard to avoid it no matter where you go. I just got a notification from 23andMe of all places that said, we've had some suspicious activity going on. And I'm like, for real? It's my health data. But, you know, at the same time, I believe they're owned by a corporation that's a health company now. So I'm sure my insurance provider knows a lot more about my medical than they would have if I had never used 23andMe. But I wanted the benefit from it, and that was a trade-off I made. And when they sold themselves to a health company, my data went with it. Anyway.
I see your hand. Go ahead.
Discussions like this always get me nervous toward thinking about a solution. And it brings several things to mind. One is that there seems to be an ubiquitous feeling of powerlessness, that these things are coming, they're going to happen, which makes me want to say, okay, then what? But I'm not sure what that then what is. I also wonder if how others feel. Can't comment on all of society, and I don't know if anyone's seen useful data or surveys, but I wonder if there's a general malaise out there about privacy, where people are all too willing to surrender to the notion of, well, there's nothing that, you know, I can do. And if that malaise in part comes from just a lack of understanding about what the potential implications are. So I'm kind of bookending this notion of then what by saying, I wonder if there's a need for a lot more education and a lot more explicit articulation about what the harms are. And would that, you know, be a form of education that would lead people to be a little bit more actively engaged with this topic and less likely to surrender to it, and thereby maybe make more informed consumer decisions about, you know, whether to buy the product or tick the box. So going back to the beginning, you know, what are the harms? I think I know some harms. You know, if we look in history, there have been times where the availability of information has led to things like unfair arrest, unfair incarceration, stereotyping, genocide even, and some of that sounds rather alarmist. But I don't know if it is. It depends upon the historical context and how those things move. So it seems like a good understanding of history and understanding of how that connects to privacy issues would be important. But separate from that, there's also that queasy feeling that we get about being spied upon, and where does that come from? And I think maybe Dr. Beaver could answer that. Maybe it comes from this notion of autonomy and self-agency. And so is there an inherent harm in losing that autonomy, even if we're not heading to some control state where losing our autonomy could lead to the state overrunning our individual freedoms and rights? Is there also an inherent damage when you don't have autonomy and agency? And that's what's being triggered when we have that queasy feeling. So, what do we do now? How do people react, and what do we do about it is kind of the overarching theme I'm introducing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting data about generational differences that I think gets to that autonomy question. I think it's the case, and I've shared in the chat some EU data, but this is definitely true. Comparable data sets in the US too. Older generations of Americans and apparently Europeans too worry a lot more about their autonomy. And that is because I think we were enculturated, my generation and Steve, maybe yours, were enculturated into a world in which our capacity to make free decisions was paramount. And I think younger generations have seen a radical shift thanks to information technologies, that they are less worried about that because they're more interested in benefits. And actually, there's some really fascinating, I find them fascinating contemporary examples of this in the US. The Common Rule revision, and I know, Steve, you've heard me talk about this a million times, and Alex too, but the Common Rule revisions, the federal guidelines that guide how human subjects are protected, goes through a regular period of open commentary. And in the last iteration, federal regulators proposed including de-identified biospecimens under the Common Rule. And the public said, nah, to summarize and paraphrase. And regulators said that the reason that they saw in the public commentary, predominant reason, was that commentators were more interested in public goods than they were about individual privacy. They were more interested in their medical data being potentially used to cure a disease or create a new drug that would benefit a lot of people than they were about their data being protected. Now, I don't know how wide that spreads because it's not really a representative sample that comments, but there are generational differences, and I think that's super interesting.
During COVID, I made a lot of enemies as I tried to hold up the flag for privacy, while I was told, no, I want to know everyone who's vaccinated and who's not. And I was like, why do you deserve to know that? Like, I was a big staunch proponent for individuals still having privacy during COVID, their location information, whether they've been vaccinated, which one they had, if they did get vaccinated. I mean, there was, I wouldn't, and I was at a loss. Like, I was told, you know what, public safety is going to trump every time privacy. And I'm like, I get that to an extent, but you can't use it to abuse it either.
Right. Yeah, that seems contextual, right? I readily imagine a nationwide argument that would say, look, in this instance of COVID-19, public health is going to maybe trump these individual privacies, but that can't be a sustained argument because the context changes, right? I mean, I want to push us a little bit because we've done a really thoughtful job of mapping things in this way. We started from thinking about privacy as an individual phenomenon, and then we started thinking about our individual information extended out digitally through digital technologies, like as a second iteration of privacy. We've talked then about the way that those iterations affect one another. So that's a third iteration. Then there's the next iteration, which pushes us towards the AI. How do you and I eventually intersect in privacy dialogues with AI? And then I think there's a fifth iteration that we're heading towards at breakneck speed. And that is what happens when two artificial systems start talking to one another. I think I mapped this out last year with a colleague in a piece on the ethics of privacy, where we called these 1 through 5, privacy 1 through 5, thinking about the way that we're moving from individuals to artificiality across the spectrum. And that broadening out is happening really, really fast. And we barely have a handle, I would argue, on privacy 2.0, this idea that our information is extended digitally. That's really what we've talked about for the last 20 minutes. But now we're being pushed into extended digitally by artificial agents, and then artificial agents in dialogue with one another. And what that means for privacy, I mean, I'm maybe leaning towards you, Dr. Kubler, and sort of saying, like, maybe the only option is to opt out, right? To sort of be like, look, nope, I'm not going to participate in the digital economy anymore because I don't know what that's going to look like.
I think I've kind of opted out. I can't even remember the name of the tool, but not Siri, but the little button thing that sits on your table and maybe connects to Google or whatever. So you can tell how informed I am. Mom was trying to be nice and sent us one for Christmas. I sent it back. I don't know what the darn thing does. And I don't need to buy any more stuff. So I tend to be a not buyer. I can guess if you're an early acquirer of technology, you'd love it. Or if you want the latest and greatest thing, you'd be shopping a lot and maybe that would be useful. I just don't need another spy in my home. And I can also adjust the thermostat manually. I'm pretty good with that.
Yeah, I think you align in that way. To overshare with everybody, and Steve, you know this, but during the pandemic, I got into a side hobby of buying and repairing robot vacuums. I love robot vacuums; they're great. But there's a limit. My threshold is Wi-Fi connected robot vacuums, right? I'm just not at all interested in sharing data where I really don't understand where it's going and in what context and what it could connect to out in the digital ecosystem. So my limit was non-Wi-Fi connected robot vacuums. And if any of you are interested in robot vacuums, my goodness, I can tell you a lot about those things at this point.
No, but I can see a market there where the robot vacuum analyzes your dirt and then sends that information somewhere.
It analyzes your floor plan.
Yes, it does that.
This
Analyzing
might
your
be
dirt next. Go, Michael. Yeah.
like a slight overshare, but like I use a CPAP. And so when I was talking to somebody that, the home office or something, I should have known this, but I was a little surprised that, yeah, she basically knew my sleep schedule. Like she knew exactly like when I was sleeping at home and when I wasn't sleeping at home. And I just think that's a bit of an overshare too. And if their data was ever breached, I mean, that's something else like that. That's health information that we give up in order to be medically, secure.
Yep.
Well, I was going to say, as a biological woman who uses medical apps that may monitor certain things each month, that has been a particular issue that has come up over the last few years, whether you should or shouldn't use those particular apps for a variety of different reasons. But even to Michael's point, I'm wearing an Apple Watch right now, and if I wear that at night, it will monitor my sleep patterns as well. So yeah, those things are, do you use those things? Do you not use those for either efficiency's sake, information gathering, and then where does that data go? And are you aware of where that data goes? I think that is, especially in the context of female apps, those are particularly challenging and troubling.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was a side point in the podcast, but Professor Valise made this point that we could learn a lot from bioethics. And we do seem to treat our medical data as distinct, or we worry about it in distinct ways from our other data. And the problem there is that there's no distinction anymore, right? Our medical data just is our digital data, and our digital data can be medicalized. And that's just, it's a mess right now. But yeah, so to your point, yeah, especially those technologies in Florida right now. I mean, yeah, I'm with you. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all. So I was just thinking about what Sarah said. So I have a bed that monitors how well I sleep, and I know it feeds it into, the corporation that makes the bed. And so I started to think, well, and the reason I do it is because I want to know how well I slept. Like, did I get 7 hours solid? Did I get 6.5? Did I get 7.5? Did I get 8? Whatever. And did I wake up? When might I have woken up? What might have caused it? So these are all interesting things to me as I monitor my sleep. But I wonder if, let's say Advent Health or United Healthcare purchases that data, let's say from Sleep Number, and then now says, okay, well, Dan's one of our customers, and it looks like he doesn't have really good sleep. If we're gonna insure him, we might take that into consideration, or even worse, an insurance policy that looks at my health to say, okay, we're going to give you life insurance. As they start to rate me, are they going to companies like Sleep Number and paying, however many dollars per record, so they can try to figure out who they're insuring and what their health issues are? I used to wear a CPAP. And so, that was on my, I don't know how they wouldn't have known that, right? But if my CPAP were digitally connected, mine wasn't. But then it would tell, them how well, and even if I'm using it at all, because there were nights I just didn't wear it. And so if they're seeing I'm not using what I'm medically prescribed, maybe that works against me in a healthcare context. So there's all sorts. I mean, data is everywhere, and we can only control what we can control. There's only so much that we're going to be able to handle when it comes to that. Everything else is unfortunately out of our hands for the moment, but between regulation and awareness and making the effort to go into settings and trying to change, like the websites that even save your credit card. If you shop there frequently, like Amazon, fine, they can keep my credit card data. But if I make a one-time purchase on, youku.com or something for some item for my son, am I really going to have them save my credit card? If they get breached, they're going to, now everybody's got it. It's just one of those things. We have to make prudent choices with our data as best we can and understand, of course, that there's a realm of a locus of control that we have, and then there's the rest that we just can't control. And that flows into AI hard.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. Michael, you say in the chat that like there's a connection between the insurance companies monitoring the use of medical devices.
Right. Yeah. If you're not using it, like compliance is like, if you're using it less than like 5 nights a week or something, then at least during the first year, your insurance company might not decide to pay for your CPAP, which is a few $1,000s. So do I want to spend a few $1,000s out of pocket and avoid the privacy issues? Like that's kind of beyond my means right now to spend a couple thousand on a CPAP and not have the tracking and things like that.
Yeah, totally. And again, so this brings up the other point that I think is really important and we didn't spend any time on today, and that is the sort of power and power inequalities and disparities, right? A lot of these technologies are going to have and will continue to exacerbate disparity, right? So to Michael, to your point, if you had a couple of $1,000s, you could make a decision to protect your data. But if you don't have a couple of $1,000s, you are kind of forced into giving up some of your data. And again, in the case of your example, maybe it's not that big a deal. It's medical information. It's treated differently anyway, thanks to existing federal regulations. But the same can be said of any of our data, right? If you had enough money, you could get sleep information, Dan, or your example, or 23andMe genetic data, and keep that private, keep that to yourself, work one-on-one with a provider in a different landscape. But if you want it done for cheap, you're getting it done for cheap because you're giving up a lot of information. And your information
make that an option. Like, why wouldn't they say, hey, you can pay for a premium account and your data will never be shared. It'll be anonymized. It'll be part of our general, right? If you pay for it. If you don't, you can still use our services, but the cost is that we will be sharing your information in the following ways. And now give the user choice. Choice is huge. Notice is important to let me know what you're doing, but then comes choice and consent. And those are concepts that unfortunately the US hasn't embraced like Europe has. And so we have this unfortunate situation where they'll just use our data the way they feel it's best. Forget giving us choice. You want to use Facebook, you're going to sell yourself to Facebook, period.
But I think there's also, Dan, to your point, I think, yes, having that option, I think it's choice is great, but yet there's also still this inequity issue of what if I can't afford to pay for the premium version that might protect my data more and I don't have a choice, or I'm a college student and that's just not in my budget. I think there's that gap and inherent disparity that's going to be sort of already added to it that we have to deal with too.
Yeah. And I would hope, I guess, if it were me, I would think, all right, well, maybe, right now I don't need to know, I don't need to have a subscription about my sleep data. I have other priorities to worry about so that I can eventually afford it. But yes, there is that inequity. And it's like, well, what do? Maybe they give academic pricing to students, but eventually it's going to come down to, well, what about the 77-year-old who's on Social Security and really needs to know how well they're sleeping, but they can't afford your service? But I mean, that at the same time, that's the predication of everything, right? There's the 66-year-old who wants a car but can't afford it. Well, what do we do? Right? Do we just tell that person, hey, government, buy me a car? No, we have to figure out what led them there, and maybe help them in some way. They can raise funds for it. But we can't solve all of that, and so either we can't take it away from everyone because some folks can't afford it. We just have to recognize that some folks can't afford. There are many things I can't afford, that I just recognize if I had done something different in my world or been born differently, perhaps I could afford it, but I can't get it. But it's the basic needs, the necessities, not how well I slept, but the food, water, shelter that I want to make sure that everybody has access to, whether they can afford it or not. And then beyond that, it's okay, well, how do you raise your ability to get what you want out of life? You may want the fancy car, but if you can afford it, great. If you can't, you might not get the fancy car.
And this for me is where ethics slips back into the conversation, because Dr. Kubler, one of my favorite arguments from you is that we are part of our job as educators is to help our students in particular, but everyone cultivate a sense of individual responsibility, to recognize that you can choose and that you have to make good decisions when you choose, and to recognize when you're manipulated to make other decisions is just part of what it is to sort of become educated.
Thank you for that shout out on my shtick there. But from that, and also reconnecting to what Dan and Sarah were saying, I think it's definitely, there's a social justice and an equity issue. If sharing your data is potential to be exploited, the people who have the least socioeconomic status are going to be the most exploitable. And then it also connects to an education issue, because if you're not aware of the potential harms, you'll buy into it more readily. If you don't understand, if you don't happen to come from a background or have the education that helps you understand the potential downstream implications of giving away all your data and how it can be exploited, you're more likely to click the accept button. So it's a social justice, socioeconomic issue, as well as an education issue. And when I talked earlier about what's the solution, I just keep coming back to kind of the societal responsibility to support education. It's a good argument for public education, how we need to have these kinds of discussions and make sure that they are lively discussions, as this one has been, where they're informed by information and data, so that they're not indoctrinations, but they're truly educational in setting up the pros and the cons and the potential for empowerment. So Dan sets up that there should be an opportunity to buy in to something or maybe pay a higher fee. So there's a scheme for empowerment. Education enables empowerment. Supporting these kinds of discussions to get the word out and get people thinking about this is also a kind of empowerment. And that returns some of the agency that's maybe being sacrificed in an era of rapidly expanding AI.
And one more structural change I think that would be important is to kind of remove certain bottlenecks that make accessibility to certain opportunities dependent on those apps, especially, for people who have to use them, assuming that there was an option to, pay and opt out of privacy violations, still wouldn't be able to do that. Assuming you need to use a particular app or, whatever form of AI for your work, whether that is a communication thing or whether it is something, some sort of database that you need to use to do your job, things like that. I think there should always be options that are free of these problems, of this potential for exploitation, that people should be able to legitimately use as alternatives if they want to avoid that. And we should not kind of be coerced in this, it's this or nothing, right? Because often it seems to me that in practice, that's kind of what it looks like. So maybe, amplify the ways in which we can navigate all these new challenges of the workplace and find multiple types of solutions to these problems, not just, we picked as a corporation to use this app and it's done, and anyone who doesn't want to use it for whatever reason is effectively excluded, right? I think that's also a corporate responsibility, for instance, to examine the kinds of apps that they force their employees to use or things of that sort.
Yeah, options make good sense, and that has to go all up and down the spectrum too, right, Alex? I mean, it's got to be on the design of these systems in the first place, the choice of whether or not we use them, how they're incentivized, and then the responsibility of the users on the other end. Yeah, all up and down that ecosystem. I mean, I think, again, the interesting thing for me about this discussion is that we've spent a lot of time talking about the landscape that we already are in. And the next question is like, what does the next landscape look like with the rise of AI? And I don't think we can answer that question right now, but these kind of discussions should stimulate us thinking about the potential risks coming down the road. Thank you all for being here today. This was so much fun. On the next Friday the 27th of October, we'll be talking AI and environments. And by that, I mean both the physical infrastructure that runs the servers and systems, but also virtual environments that might be included in AI. So that'll be our next topic of discussion. Again, I'm really grateful for this discussion and for you all to be here. And Michael and Parker, thank you for joining us as new attendees. I hope I'll see you back again. And thanks to everybody else for being here too.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah, Thank you.
Yeah,
Very
thank you.
Thanks,
Mhm.
everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a good rest of the week, all.
Mhm.